My husband thought it would be hilarious to give me divorce papers on Christmas morning while his mistress watched from our kitchen. Cops always think they're so smart, he smirked. I signed them immediately, then handed him a gift that made him realize he'd just confessed to a felony on camera. The red recording light blinked steadily in the corner of our living room, hidden behind the garland I'd carefully positioned 3 days earlier. Sheldon had no idea that every word, every cruel laugh, every calculated moment of his perfect plan was being captured in 4K resolution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He also didn't know that the woman making coffee in our kitchen, the one he'd been sleeping with for 8 months, was about to become the star witness in his own destruction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with Christmas morning. The morning everything changed, though the real story began long before that. I woke up at 5:47 a.m., not because I wanted to, but because 15 years as a detective had trained my body to function on minimal sleep and maximum alertness. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the coffee maker I'd set the night before. Sheldon was still asleep, face buried in his pillow, looking innocent in that way only sleeping people can manage. I'd learned not to trust that innocence. Our Christmas tree stood in the corner, perfectly decorated with the ornaments we'd collected over our 12 years of marriage. Each one told a story: the handmade angel from our first Christmas together, the our first home bauble from 2015, the delicate glass snowflakes from our honeymoon in Vermont. They glittered in the early morning light, beautiful and oblivious to what was coming. I made my coffee extra strong that morning. Something felt different, though I couldn't place what. It wasn't intuition exactly. Cops learn to distinguish between gut feelings and paranoia, but there was an electricity in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sheldon appeared in the doorway at 7:15, wearing the flannel pajamas I'd bought him last Christmas. His hair was messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, but there was something else there. Something that looked almost like anticipation. "Merry Christmas, beautiful," he said, kissing my forehead in that automatic way married couples do. But his smile was different. Sharper, like he was holding back laughter. "Merry Christmas," I replied, studying his face with the same attention I'd used to read a suspect during interrogation. "You're up early. Big day," he said, moving to the coffee pot. "I've got something special planned." The way he said special made my stomach tighten. In my line of work, you learn that when someone emphasizes words like that, they're usually hiding something significant. We moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots on the couch. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But I'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments often disguise themselves as the most ordinary ones. "Should we start with presents?" Sheldon asked, but again there was that barely contained excitement in his voice. I nodded, reaching for the small wrapped box I'd placed under the tree for him. It was a new watch, expensive, thoughtful, the kind of gift a loving wife gives her husband. The irony of that would hit me later. He opened it with the appropriate enthusiasm, kissing me and telling me how perfect it was. But his eyes kept darting toward the tree, toward something I couldn't see from my angle. "Your turn," he said, standing up and reaching behind the tree. He pulled out an envelope, plain white, nothing decorative about it. Not wrapped, not even in a Christmas card. Just an envelope with my name written across the front in his careful handwriting. "What's this?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my chest. "Open it," he said, settling back into his chair. That anticipation was clearer now, mixed with something that looked disturbingly like malice. I opened the envelope slowly, detective instincts kicking in. Inside were papers, legal documents. My eyes scanned the first page, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers." On Christmas morning, I looked up at Sheldon, who was watching me with the same expression I'd seen on suspects who thought they'd outsmarted the system. Cruel satisfaction mixed with anticipation. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. That's when I heard it, soft laughter from the kitchen. Female laughter. My head snapped toward the sound, and there she was. Bethany Lynch, my husband's work colleague, standing in our kitchen doorway, wearing one of my robes, and holding a cup of coffee like she belonged there. "I told you she'd be shocked," Bethany said. Her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes from someone who enjoys watching others suffer. Look at her face. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't just about divorce papers. This was theater. Performance. They'd planned this moment, choreographed it, turned my marriage into entertainment. "How long?" I asked. My voice steadier than I felt. "How long what?" Sheldon's smile was widening. "How long has she been here? How long have you been planning this little show?" "She spent the night," he said casually, like he was discussing the weather. "We thought it would be more impactful this way." Bethany moved closer, settling onto the arm of Sheldon's chair, like she owned the place. "He wanted to do it on New Year's, but I thought Christmas morning would be more memorable." I stared at them, these two people who had turned my life into their private joke, and something shifted inside me. Not anger, that would come later. This was something colder, more focused. The same feeling I got when a case finally started making sense. "You've been planning this," I said. It wasn't a question. "For months," Bethany confirmed, clearly proud of their elaborate scheme. "The timing, the location, even getting me here for the grand finale. Sheldon wanted to make sure you'd never forget this moment." She was right about that. I would never forget this moment, but not for the reason she thought. I looked down at the divorce papers again, noting the date they were filed, the lawyer's name, the careful preparation that had gone into this moment. Then I looked up at my husband and his mistress, both of them watching me with the expectation of tears, of begging, of the breakdown they'd so carefully orchestrated. Instead, I smiled. "You know what?" I said, standing up and walking to the kitchen counter where I kept a pen. "This is perfect timing." I signed the papers quickly, efficiently, with the same calm precision I used to sign arrest warrants. When I finished, I looked up to find them both staring at me, confusion replacing their earlier satisfaction. "That's it?" Sheldon asked. "That's it," I confirmed, walking back to the tree. "But I have something for you too." I reached behind the tree and pulled out a beautifully wrapped gift box, red paper, gold ribbon, the works. I'd prepared it 3 days ago, though I'd hoped I'd never need to use it. "What's this?" Sheldon asked, wariness creeping into his voice. "Your real Christmas present," I said, handing it to him. "I think you're gonna find it unforgettable." He took the box, and for the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Bethany moved closer, equally curious. "Open it," I said, settling back into my chair with my coffee. The next few minutes would change everything. But as I watched my husband's hands shake slightly as he untied the ribbon, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt completely calm. After all, I'd had a very long time to prepare for this moment. 3 months earlier, I was finishing my shift at the precinct when my phone buzzed with a text from Connor Quinn, my partner of 8 years. "Check the surveillance footage from the Marriott case. Something weird on camera 3, timestamp 14:32. I was exhausted, ready to go home to Sheldon and the leftover Chinese food waiting in our fridge, but Connor's instincts were usually spot on. I pulled up the footage on my computer, scrolling to the timestamp he'd mentioned. The Marriott case was routine, a break-in at the downtown hotel, insurance fraud investigation. Nothing that should have produced anything weird, but as I watched the grainy security footage, my blood turned to ice. There, clear as day on camera 3, was my husband. Sheldon Lynch, the man I'd been married to for 12 years, walking through the Marriott lobby at 2:32 p.m. on a Tuesday. His arm was wrapped around a woman I recognized immediately. Bethany Lynch, the colleague he'd mentioned once or twice from his marketing firm. But this wasn't a business meeting. His hand was on her lower back, intimate and possessive. She was laughing at something he'd whispered in her ear. As they approached the elevator, he pulled her closer and kissed her neck. I watched the timestamp. Tuesday, 2:32 p.m. The same Tuesday he'd told me he was working late, wouldn't be home until after 8. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The same Tuesday I'd texted him asking if he wanted me to save him dinner, and he'd replied, "In meetings all day, might grab something with the team." I rewound the footage and watched it again. Then again. Each time, the intimacy between them became more obvious. This wasn't their first time at this hotel. They moved through the lobby like they owned the place, like they'd done this dance before. My phone rang. "Connor, you see it?" he asked, without preamble. "I see it." My voice sounded strange, distant. "Aubrey, I'm sorry. I almost didn't call, but you're a good partner," I finished. "Thank you." There was a pause. "What do you need?" That was Connor, straight to the point. No unnecessary sympathy. In 15 years of police work, I'd learned that sympathy was a luxury you couldn't afford when you needed to think clearly. "I need to know how long," I said. "Can you pull more footage? Other dates?" "Already on it. I'll have something by tomorrow morning." I hung up and stared at the frozen frame on my computer screen. Sheldon's hand on another woman's back, her face tilted up toward his, adoring and familiar. Everything about their body language screamed long-term relationship. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying conversations, looking for signs I'd missed. Had he been different lately? Distant, more secretive with his phone? The truth was, I'd been so focused on work, a string of difficult cases, long hours, the usual grind, that I'd stopped paying attention to the small details. When I walked into our house, Sheldon was exactly where I'd expected him to be, on the couch, watching the news, a beer in his hand. He looked up and smiled, the same warm smile he'd been giving me for over a decade. "Hey beautiful. How was your day?" "The usual," I said, studying his face for any sign of guilt. There was none. He was completely relaxed, completely normal. "How was yours?" "Boring meetings all day. You know how it is." I did know how it was. I also knew he was lying. I went through the motions of our evening routine, changing out of my uniform, heating up dinner, asking about his day, while he asked about mine. He told me about a difficult client, a presentation he was working on, his plans for the weekend, all of it delivered with the easy confidence of someone who had no idea his world was about to implode. That night, as he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process what I'd seen. 15 years as a cop had taught me to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from evidence, but this was different. This was my life, my marriage, my future crumbling in real time. The next morning, Connor met me at our usual coffee shop before shift. He slid a manila folder across the table without a word. "How bad?" I asked. "Bad. 8 months, minimum. Maybe longer." I opened the folder. Inside were printed screenshots from various hotel security systems around the city. The Marriott, the Hilton, the boutique place on 5th Street. Different dates, different locations, but the same 2 people. My husband and Bethany Lynch, acting like lovers. The earliest timestamp was from March, 8 months ago. In that footage, they were more careful, more cautious. But even then, the intimacy was unmistakable. "There's more," Connor said quietly. "Credit card records. He's been paying for these rooms with a card you probably don't know about." He was right. I didn't know about any separate credit card. But then again, I'd never had reason to look. "What else?" I asked. "Restaurant charges. Always the same day as the hotel visits. Always for 2 people. Always expensive." He paused. "Aubrey, this isn't just sex, this is a relationship." I closed the folder and stared at my coffee. 8 months. While I'd been working late, solving cases, keeping our city safe, my husband had been building an entire secret life with another woman. "What are you going to do?" Connor asked. That was the question, wasn't it? I could confront him, Demand answers. Maybe try counseling. I could pretend I'd never seen the footage, hope it would end on its own. I could file for divorce and divide our assets down the middle. Or I could do what I'd been trained to do. I could investigate. I'm going to find out exactly what I'm dealing with, I said finally. Before I make any decisions, I need to know the full scope. Connor nodded slowly. You want help? Not officially. But if you happen to come across anything else, I'll let you know. I spent the rest of that day in a strange detached state. I processed evidence, interviewed witnesses, wrote reports, all while my personal life burned in the background. It was almost surreal, the way I could function normally, while everything I'd believed about my marriage crumbled. That evening, I started my own investigation. I began with what I knew: the hotel visits, the credit card charges, the timeline Connor had established. But I needed more. I needed to understand not just what Sheldon was doing, but why. What had driven him to this? How long had he been planning to leave me? And most importantly, what did he think would happen when I found out? Because I was going to find out everything. Every lie, every secret, every moment of betrayal. And then I was going to decide exactly what kind of Christmas present he deserved. Looking back, I realized the signs had been there for over a year, hidden in plain sight, like clues at a crime scene I was too close to properly investigate. The shift had been so gradual, so subtle, that I'd attributed it to normal marriage evolution, rather than systematic deception. It started with the phone. Sheldon had always been casual about his device, leaving it face up on counters, asking me to check his messages while he drove, sharing funny texts he'd received from friends. But sometime around last Christmas, that changed. The phone started living face down. He'd take it with him to the bathroom, to get coffee, even to check the mail. When I'd reach for it absently to see the time, he'd snatch it away with a quick, "I've got it." "New security protocols at work," he'd explained when I finally asked. "They're cracking down on personal device access." I'd accepted it because I wanted to. Because questioning your husband's sudden phone security feels petty and paranoid, especially when you're a cop who deals with actual criminals all day. Then came the grooming changes. Sheldon had never been vain, but he'd always taken care of himself. Suddenly, he was trying new colognes, spending more time in front of the mirror, buying clothes without my input. He joined a gym I'd never seen, started talking about getting back in shape, even though he'd never been out of shape. Midlife crisis. My sister Ella had laughed when I mentioned it during our monthly dinner. At least he's not buying a motorcycle. But it wasn't just vanity, it was preparation. He was making himself attractive for someone else, and I was watching it happen while convincing myself it was about self-improvement. The work schedule changes were the most obvious red flag I'd ignored. For 11 years Sheldon had been predictable, home by 6:30, rarely worked weekends, always available for family events. Suddenly, he was swamped with client dinners and weekend strategy sessions. Projects that required late nights became the norm rather than the exception. "They're expanding the team," he'd explained, kissing my forehead as he left for another mandatory happy hour. "More responsibility, more FaceTime with clients. It's good for my career." I'd supported it because that's what partners do. I'd even felt proud of his dedication, his ambition. I'd covered for him at family gatherings, made excuses when he missed dinner plans, rearranged my own schedule to accommodate his sudden busy social life. The intimacy between us had shifted too, though so gradually I'd barely noticed. We'd always been affectionate, hand-holding during movies, spontaneous kisses while cooking. The kind of easy physical connection that develops over years together. But that had faded into something more perfunctory. Kisses became pecks, hugs became brief pats. Even our conversations had become surface level, focused on logistics rather than connection. Sex had become scheduled, predictable, and then increasingly rare. When I'd tried to initiate, he'd often beg off with excuses about stress, work pressure, exhaustion. But he'd still have energy for his mysterious late-night client calls and weekend team-building activities. "We're just settling into a comfortable routine," he'd said, when I'd finally mentioned feeling disconnected. Not every couple needs to be all over each other after 12 years. He was right, of course. Long-term relationships did settle into patterns. But I'd started to feel like we were roommates rather than spouses, and I'd blamed my job, my hours, my own emotional unavailability as a cop. The financial changes were subtler, but in retrospect more telling. We'd always maintained separate accounts for personal spending while sharing household expenses, but I'd started noticing irregularities, cash withdrawals I couldn't account for, charges on our joint credit card that he'd explain away as work expenses or gifts for his team. "I'm handling more client entertainment now," he'd say. When I'd ask about expensive restaurant charges, "It's all reimbursable, don't worry about it." But when I'd mentioned it to Connor one day, he'd raised an eyebrow. "Marketing guys don't usually get unlimited expense accounts for client dinners. That's more of a sales thing." I'd defended Sheldon automatically, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Why was he spending so much money on work entertainment? Why were the charges always on days when he came home late and distracted? The social changes were perhaps the most painful to recognize. Sheldon had always been gregarious, the life of the party at family gatherings and friend get-togethers. But over the past year, he'd become critical of our social circle, dismissive of events I enjoyed, eager to leave early from gatherings that used to energize him. "Your family asks too many questions," he'd complained after my cousin's wedding. "And Connor talks shop all night. Can't we just relax without hearing about your cases?" He'd started suggesting we skip events, decline invitations, reduce our social commitments. At the time, I'd thought he was just tired, stressed from work. But now I realized he was creating space in his schedule for someone else's family, someone else's friends, someone else's life. The most insidious change was how he'd started treating me. Not obviously cruel, Sheldon was too smart for that, but with a kind of casual dismissiveness that ate away at my confidence. He'd interrupt me during conversations, correct me in front of others, make jokes at my expense that weren't quite mean enough to call out, but weren't quite harmless either. "Aubrey's always dramatic about these things," he'd say when I'd share a difficult case, or express frustration about work. "Cops see criminals everywhere. Or she's been working too hard lately. You know how it is with law enforcement, they start thinking everyone's suspicious." He'd frame it as affection, as knowing me well enough to explain my quirks to others. But each comment chipped away at my sense of self, made me question my own perceptions, my own instincts. The pattern was clear now: systematic distancing, emotional withdrawal, and gradual devaluation. He'd been preparing me for his departure while simultaneously preparing himself for his new life. Every late night, every dismissive comment, every mysterious expense had been part of a carefully orchestrated exit strategy. I'd been so focused on being a good wife, a supportive partner, that I'd ignored every single warning sign. But now, sitting in my car outside the precinct, with Connor's evidence folder in my lap, I realized that my training as a detective had been preparing me for this moment all along. Because if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was build an airtight case. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was realizing how small I'd allowed myself to become in my own life. As I sat in that coffee shop with Connor's evidence spread across the table, I tried to remember the last time I'd felt confident in my own home, the last time I'd spoken without second-guessing myself, the last time I'd felt like Aubrey Aldon, the person rather than just Sheldon's wife. It had been gradual. So gradual I hadn't noticed it happening. Like a slow leak in a tire, my sense of self had deflated over months until I was running on empty, without even realizing it. Take my clothes, for instance. I'd always dressed professionally for work. Crisp uniforms, polished boots, everything regulation and sharp. But at home, I'd started choosing softer colors, quieter styles. Nothing that would draw attention or spark comments. Sheldon had developed this habit of scanning my outfit choices with barely concealed judgment. "That's a bit much for dinner at your sister's, don't you think?" he'd say, about a red dress I'd worn dozens of times before. Or "the neighbors are going to think we're trying too hard," about a blazer that made me feel confident and put together. Each comment came with a smile, delivered as helpful advice rather than criticism. But the effect was the same. I'd change clothes, choose something more muted, more acceptable. My closet had gradually filled with beige and navy blue, while the jewel tones I'd always loved got pushed to the back. The same thing had happened with my opinions. I'd stopped sharing stories from work that might make others uncomfortable. I'd started agreeing with Sheldon's political views even when they conflicted with my own. I'd learned to laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny, to nod along with his observations even when I disagreed. Aubrey always has such strong opinions about everything, he'd started saying at dinner parties, with that indulgent tone you'd use to describe a child's behavior. Occupational hazard, I suppose. The implication was clear: my thoughts were too intense, too much, too aggressive for polite company. So I'd learned to soften them, to present them as questions rather than statements, to defer to his expertise on subjects where I actually knew more than he did. My friendships had suffered too. Shelley Romoff, my partner before Connor, had invited me to her daughter's birthday party 6 months ago. I'd wanted to go. Shelley and I had worked some difficult cases together, and I genuinely cared about her family. But Sheldon had sighed heavily when I'd mentioned it. "Another cop party," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "We just went to that retirement thing for your sergeant. People are going to think we don't have any other friends." I'd made excuses to Shelley, told her I had a conflict. She'd understood, but I'd seen the disappointment in her eyes. How many times had I done that? How many invitations had I declined? How many friendships had I let fade, because maintaining them felt like too much work, too much justification? Even my relationship with my own family had become strained. My parents lived 3 hours away, and I'd always called them every Sunday evening. But Sheldon had started scheduling things during those calls: romantic dinners, important conversations, sudden needs for my attention. "Can't you call them tomorrow?" he'd ask, standing in the doorway while I dialed. "I wanted to talk to you about something." The something was usually trivial: a work story, a show he wanted to watch, a problem that could have waited. But I'd learned to prioritize his needs over my own routine, to cut my conversations short when he appeared with that particular expression of patient suffering. My mother had noticed. "You seem distracted lately," she'd said during our last call. "Everything okay?" "Just busy with work," I'd replied, while Sheldon hovered nearby, clearly waiting for me to hang up. But it wasn't just work, it was the exhausting mental labor of constantly monitoring my husband's mood, anticipating his needs, avoiding topics that might annoy him. I'd become a student of his expressions, his tone of voice, his body language. I could tell from the way he closed the front door whether he'd had a good day or a bad one. I could predict from his morning coffee routine whether he'd be receptive to conversation or prefer silence. This hypervigilance had started to affect my work performance. Connor had noticed it first. "You're second-guessing yourself," he'd said, after I'd deferred to a junior officer's judgment on a case where I clearly had more experience. "That's not like you." He was right. The Aubrey who'd graduated from the police academy 15 years ago had been confident, decisive, willing to trust her instincts. But somewhere along the way, I'd learned to doubt myself, to seek validation for decisions I could have made automatically. The breaking point had come 3 weeks before I saw the hotel footage. We'd been at a barbecue at Connor's house, and I'd been telling a story about a particularly clever suspect we'd caught through careful surveillance work. I'd been animated, engaged, feeling like myself for the first time in weeks. "Aubrey always has to be the hero of every story," Sheldon had interrupted with a laugh. "You'd think she was the only competent cop in the entire department." The table had gone quiet. Connor's wife, Bethany Quinn, had looked uncomfortable. Even Luke Aldon, Connor's brother who barely knew me, had seemed taken aback by the casual cruelty of the comment. But I'd laughed along. I'd actually laughed and made a self-deprecating joke about being too competitive. I'd deflected and minimized and turned myself into the punchline of my own story. That night, lying in bed, I'd realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt proud of myself. The last time I'd shared an accomplishment without immediately downplaying it. The last time I'd felt like my thoughts, my work, my very existence mattered to the person who was supposed to love me most. I'd started sleeping poorly, waking up at 3 a.m. with a weight in my chest that I couldn't name. I'd catch myself holding my breath during conversations, bracing for the next correction, the next subtle put-down, the next reminder that I was too much, too intense, too difficult. Now sitting with the evidence of his betrayal, I understood what that weight had been. It wasn't anxiety or stress or work pressure. It was the suffocating awareness that I'd been slowly disappearing from my own life, one compromise at a time, one swallowed opinion at a time, one avoided confrontation at a time. But there was something else too, something that had been building beneath the surface even as I'd been shrinking above it. A quiet voice that had been growing stronger even as I'd been growing smaller. The voice that reminded me I was a detective. One self a kam befar, Matsenbindavav, that I was trained to see patterns, to gather evidence, to build cases, that I was skilled at reading people, at anticipating their moves, at staying 3 steps ahead. Sheldon had been playing a game he thought I didn't know about, but he'd forgotten something crucial about the woman he'd been systematically diminishing. I was very, very good at my job, and now my job was finding out exactly what he'd been doing, and making sure he never had the chance to do it again. The catalyst came disguised as a routine traffic stop on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I'd been running surveillance on a fraud case downtown when dispatch called about a minor fender bender blocking traffic on 5th Street. Nothing unusual, just 2 drivers exchanging insurance information while commuters honked impatiently around them. But as I approached the scene, I recognized one of the vehicles. A silver BMW sedan, license plate I'd memorized from sitting behind it in our driveway for 3 years. Sheldon's car. He was standing next to the driver's side door, gesticulating animatedly at a woman in a red Honda Civic. Standard post-accident behavior, except for the woman he was talking to. Even from 50 feet away, I could see her perfectly styled blonde hair, her expensive handbag, the way she touched his arm while they talked. Bethany Lynch. At 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, in the middle of what should have been her workday, in the middle of what should have been his workday, having a car accident together. I parked my patrol car and approached, my pulse quickening. This was it, the moment when months of suspicion would either be confirmed or dismissed. The moment when I'd either feel foolish for my paranoia or vindicated in my growing certainty. "Afternoon, folks," I said, pulling out my incident report pad. "I'm Officer Alden. I understand there was a minor collision." Sheldon's head snapped up, and for a split second, I saw pure panic flash across his face. But he recovered quickly, too quickly for someone who had nothing to hide. "Aubrey, what a coincidence," he said, moving toward me with that easy smile I'd been seeing for 12 years. "Just a little tap, nothing serious." "Right," I said, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "And you are?" I asked Bethany, though I already knew the answer. "Bethany Lynch," she said, extending her hand. "I work with Sheldon at Morrison Marketing." I shook her hand, noting the expensive manicure, the subtle perfume, the way she was studying my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "I see, and you were both heading to client lunch," Sheldon said immediately. "We were carpooling to save on parking downtown, in separate cars." The question hung in the air for a moment too long. I watched them exchange a glance, quick but unmistakable. "We had different meetings afterward," Bethany said smoothly. "It made more sense to drive separately." I nodded, writing in my pad. "Of course. Can I see your licenses and insurance information?" As they fumbled for their documents, I noticed other details. Bethany's lipstick was slightly smudged. Sheldon's hair was messier than usual, and his shirt collar was askew. They both had that particular energy that comes from interrupted intimacy. "So this happened right here?" I asked, gesturing to the intersection. "She ran the red light," Sheldon said quickly. "I had the right of way." "Actually," Bethany said, shooting him a warning look, "I think we both arrived at the intersection at the same time. It was more of a miscommunication than anyone's fault." "Interesting." They couldn't get their story straight, which meant they'd been too distracted to pay attention to basic traffic rules. Or they'd been parked somewhere nearby, engaged in activities that had nothing to do with client lunches or work meetings. "Any injuries?" I asked. "None," they both said simultaneously. "Good. I'll need to check the damage to both vehicles." I walked around Sheldon's BMW first, documenting the minimal damage to his rear bumper. But as I circled the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The passenger seat was pushed back and reclined. The center console showed evidence of recent cleaning. Too recent, too thorough for someone who'd just been in a minor accident. Bethany's Honda showed similar signs. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone much taller than her petite frame. Her car smelled like cologne, expensive cologne that I recognized, because I'd been buying it for my husband for the past 2 years. "Looks like you were both lucky," I said, returning to where they stood awkwardly apart. "Just superficial damage." "Right," Sheldon said, already moving toward his car. "Well, we should probably get going. Don't want to be late for our afternoon meetings." "Of course," I said. "Just one more question though. What time did you say this happened?" "About 20 minutes ago," Bethany said. "And you were both coming from the office," Sheldon said. "Morrison Marketing?" I asked. "Yes," I nodded, making a note. "That's interesting, because I drove past Morrison Marketing about an hour ago. There was a fire drill in progress. The entire building was evacuated." The silence stretched between like a wire about to snap. Sheldon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Bethany stared at the ground, her cheeks flushing red. "Must have been after we left," Sheldon finally said, but his voice had lost its confident "Must have been," I agreed. "Well, you're free to go. Drive safely." They separated quickly, almost frantically. No goodbye kiss, no lingering conversation. Just two people desperate to escape a situation that had become untenable. I watched them drive away in opposite directions, then sat in my patrol car and stared at my incident report. The physical evidence was minimal, a minor fender bender, no injuries, no citations issued. But the real evidence was much more damning. They'd been together in the middle of a workday, in a location that had nothing to do with their offices, or any legitimate business meeting. They'd been caught off guard, forced to improvise a story that fell apart under the most basic scrutiny, and they'd both looked guilty as hell. More importantly, they'd underestimated me. They'd assumed I'd accept their story at face value, that I'd see what they wanted me to see, rather than what was actually there. That was their first mistake, and I was going to make sure it wasn't their last. That evening, I sat at my computer and began what would become the most important investigation of my career. Not for the department, not for justice, not for the greater good. This one was personal, and I was going to be very, very thorough. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and a yellow legal pad I'd pulled from my work bag. The house was quiet. Sheldon had texted that he was working late again, and for the first time in months, I was grateful for his absence. At the top of the page I wrote Lynch Sheldon case file. The formality of it felt strange, treating my own husband like a suspect in an investigation. But that's exactly what he was now. The traffic stop had been the final piece of evidence I needed to confirm what I'd been suspecting for weeks. Now it was time to approach this systematically, professionally, the way I'd been trained. I started with what I knew for certain. September 15th, Nida's hotel surveillance footage, multiple dates spanning 8 months. September 17th, traffic stop, 5th Street, 2:30 p.m., subject and Lynch together during work hours. Suspicious financial activity, unexplained charges, cash withdrawals, behavioral changes, phone security, schedule changes, emotional distance. As I wrote, something shifted inside me. The hurt and confusion that had been clouding my judgment for months began to crystallize into something sharper, more focused. I wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. I was a detective working a case, and I was good at working cases. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document, creating a timeline of suspicious activities. The hotel visits, the unexplained expenses, the late nights, the personality changes. When I laid it all out chronologically, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a sudden affair or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, long-term deception. But more than that, it was evidence of someone who thought he was smarter than me. Someone who believed he could lie to a trained investigator and get away with it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd been playing the role of the unsuspecting wife, while he'd been playing the role of the clever cheater. But we'd both been performing for the wrong audience. He thought he was fooling me, but I was a detective. I noticed things. I remembered details. I built cases for a living. I opened another document and began typing subject, Sheldon Lynch investigation type, marital infidelity, financial deception, evidence collected, hotel surveillance, financial records, witness testimony, evidence needed, communication records, timeline verification, intent documentation. The clinical language helped. It created distance between Detective Aldon and Aubrey, the wife. Detective Aldon could think clearly, could plan methodically, could stay 3 steps ahead of her target. I picked up my phone and scrolled through our recent text exchanges. Nothing obvious. Sheldon was too smart to leave a digital trail in the messages I could see. But there might be other communications, other platforms, other devices. That's when I remembered something that made my pulse quicken. 6 months ago, Sheldon had mentioned needing a new phone for work. Security reasons, he'd said. They want us to keep work and personal communications separate. I'd thought it was reasonable at the time, but now I realized it was perfect cover for maintaining a secret relationship. A second phone meant a second digital life, completely separate from anything I might accidentally see. I made a note, locate secondary device, work phone or personal burner. My mind was racing now, connections forming like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The late nights at client dinners that coincided with hotel visits. The new gym membership at a facility across town, rather than the one 5 minutes from our house. The sudden interest in weekend team building events that never seemed to include wives. Every lie had been carefully constructed to seem plausible, even admirable. A dedicated employee working hard for his family's future. A man trying to stay in shape and maintain professional relationships. A husband who didn't want to burden his wife with boring work details. But lies always had weak spots. And I knew how to find them. I pulled up our joint bank account online and began examining charges more carefully. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Cash withdrawals on days when he claimed to be working late, followed by restaurant charges the next day. Gift purchases that never made it home. Hotel parking fees that he'd explained away as client meeting locations. Each transaction told a story, and together they painted a picture of systematic deception. But more importantly, they painted a picture of someone who thought he was untouchable. That was his second mistake. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the evidence I'd compiled. In less than 3 hours, I'd built a stronger case than some investigations took weeks to develop. I had timeline, motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. Any prosecutor would call it solid. But I wasn't building a case for court. I was building a case for justice. The difference was crucial. In court, I had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In my kitchen at my table, with my evidence, I only had to prove that someone had underestimated the wrong person. I closed my laptop and looked around my kitchen. Our kitchen, the one we'd renovated together 3 years ago, the one where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations and quiet moments. For months I'd been walking through this house like a ghost, diminished and uncertain, apologizing for taking up space in my own life. But Detective Aldon didn't apologize. Detective Aldon gathered evidence, built cases, and made sure the guilty faced consequences for their actions. I picked up my pen and added one more line to my legal pad. Obecad full extent of deception, secure evidence of intent, determine appropriate response. Then I drew a line under it and wrote, personal note. He thinks he's been playing me. Time to show him what it looks like when I play back. The woman who'd been shrinking for months was gone. In her place was someone much more dangerous. A trained investigator with unlimited time, intimate access, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Sheldon Lynch had no idea what was coming for him, but he was about to find out. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 2 years. I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out exactly how to approach this investigation without compromising myself or my career. I also needed to talk to someone I could trust completely. Ella Quinn lived 40 minutes away in a converted warehouse that she'd turned into an art studio and living space. My younger sister had always been the creative one, the free spirit, the one who saw possibilities where others saw problems. But she was also pragmatic in ways that surprised people, and she had a talent for seeing situations clearly without emotional interference. I found her in her studio, surrounded by half-finished canvases and the controlled chaos of artistic creation. She took one look at my face and set down her paintbrush. "Coffee or wine?" she asked.
Coffee.
I need to think clearly. She poured 2 cups from an expensive espresso machine that seemed out of place among the paint-splattered furniture. "What's wrong?" I handed her the manila folder Connor had given me, watching her face as she flipped through the surveillance photos. Her expression shifted from confusion to understanding to cold anger. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "Officially, 3 days. Officially? I think I've been building a case for months without realizing it." She set the folder down and studied my face. "What do you need?" That was Ella. No judgment, no unnecessary sympathy, just practical support. It's why I'd come to her instead of calling my mother or confiding in a work colleague. "I need to know my options," I said. "Legal options, financial options, strategic options." "You mean you want to know how to destroy him?" "I want to know how to protect myself and make sure he can't do this to anyone else." She nodded slowly. "What kind of evidence do you have besides the hotel photos?" I pulled out my legal pad and walked her through everything I'd documented. The financial irregularities, the behavioral changes, the lies that were becoming easier to spot now that I knew what to look for. As I talked, I watched her shift into what I privately called lawyer mode. Ella had a business degree and had managed the legal side of several art cooperatives. She understood contracts, finances, and how to build protective strategies. "First question," she said, when I finished. "Do you want to save the marriage or end it?" "I don't know if there's a marriage left to save." "That's not what I asked. Forget about his choices for a minute. What do you want?" I stared into my coffee, trying to separate my emotions from my practical assessment. "I want to feel safe again. I want to stop walking on eggshells in my own house. I want to stop wondering if everything he tells me is a lie." "Then you want to end it," she said, matter-of-factly. "The question is how to do it in a way that protects you financially and emotionally." She was right, of course. The marriage was already over. I just hadn't accepted it yet. "What about the house?" I asked. "We bought it together, but most of the down payment came from my savings. Do you have documentation of that?" "Bank records, yes, but it's all mixed together in our joint accounts now." Ella pulled out her phone and started taking notes. "We need to separate what's yours from what's joint property, and we need to do it before he realizes you know." "What do you mean?" "I mean he's probably planning his own exit strategy. Men like this don't usually leave their wives for other women, unless they have a financial plan in place." She paused. "When did you say this affair started?" "About 8 months ago, based on the hotel footage." "And when did he start the separate credit card and the cash withdrawals?" I thought back through my timeline. "Around the same time. He's been preparing," Ella said grimly. "Building separate finances, establishing a paper trail that makes it look like you were living beyond your means while he was being responsible." The implications hit me like a cold wave. "You think he's been setting me up?" "I think he's been planning this for months, and part of that plan involves making sure he comes out ahead financially." She set down her phone. "But here's the thing. He's been planning for a wife who doesn't know what he's doing. He hasn't been planning for a detective who's been building a case against him." She was right. Every lie he'd told, every deception he'd crafted, had been designed to fool someone who trusted him implicitly. But trust was evidence, and evidence could be analyzed, verified, and used to build a counter-strategy. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "I think you should do what you do best," she said. "Investigate. But this time, you're not just gathering evidence of what he's done. You're gathering evidence of what he's planning to do." She pulled out a legal pad and started writing. "First, we need to secure your assets. Move your personal savings to an account he can't access. Document everything that was yours before the marriage. Get copies of all financial records while you still have access to them." "That feels like I'm planning to leave him." "You are planning to leave him," she said, gently. "You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet." I sat with that for a moment. She was right, of course. The investigation wasn't about saving my marriage. It was about ending it on my terms rather than his. What else? I asked. Document everything. Every lie, every suspicious behavior, every piece of evidence that shows he's been planning this deception. When this goes to court, and it will go to court, you want to be the one holding all the cards. And then, Ella smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something almost predatory in her expression. Then you let him think he's in control while you systematically dismantle every advantage he thinks he has. That sounds like revenge. That sounds like justice, she corrected. There's a difference. I left Ella's studio with a clear plan, and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since I'd seen those hotel photos, I felt like I was back in control of my own life. Sheldon had been playing a long game, but he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd forgotten that I was very, very good at playing games too. The transformation had to be subtle. Too dramatic a change would alert Sheldon that something was different, but too little change would leave me trapped in the same patterns that had been slowly destroying me for months. I needed to find the perfect balance, a wife who was evolving just enough to seem natural, but not enough to seem suspicious. I started with small things. When Sheldon came home that Thursday night, spinning another elaborate story about a client crisis that had kept him at the office until 9 p.m., I listened with the same attentive expression I'd worn for months. But this time I was memorizing every detail, cataloging every inconsistency, building a mental file of his deceptions. That sounds incredibly stressful, I said, bringing him a beer without being asked. You've been working so hard lately. He relaxed into his usual post-lie routine, pleased with my sympathy, and seemingly unaware that I'd driven past his office at 6:30 p.m. and seen his parking spot empty. It's just temporary, he said, accepting the beer with the casual entitlement of someone who'd grown accustomed to being taken care of. Once this Morrison campaign launches, things should settle down. I nodded and smiled, filing away another verifiable lie. There was no Morrison campaign. I'd checked their website and social media that afternoon. Their last major campaign had launched 6 months ago, but instead of confronting him or asking probing questions, I kissed his forehead and went to finish making dinner. Perfect wife behavior, supportive, understanding, completely oblivious to his deception. The performance extended to our conversations too. Where I'd previously grown quiet and withdrawn, I started engaging more actively, but with a specific purpose. I began asking innocent questions about his work, his colleagues, his schedule. Not enough to seem suspicious, just enough to seem like an interested spouse. How's that new girl working out? I asked over dinner Friday night. Bethany, right? Sheldon's fork paused halfway to his mouth, but he recovered quickly. She's fine. Hardworking, dedicated, still learning the ropes. That's good. It must be nice to have someone eager to learn from you.
C. E. E.
Is tencha for now apa too? Wasn't double stored for kevertura dead.
Yeah. She's very appreciative of guidance.
The way he said appreciative made my skin crawl, but I kept my expression neutral, even supportive. You've always been good with mentoring people. Remember how you helped that intern 2 years ago? He smiled, pleased with what he interpreted as admiration.
I do try to be helpful.
Every conversation became an intelligence gathering operation. I learned about his team meetings that weren't on the company calendar, his client dinners that happened at restaurants I could verify were closed for renovation, his weekend strategy sessions that somehow never required him to bring any work materials home. But the most important part of the performance was emotional. I had to seem content, stable, unsuspecting. So I started smiling more, laughing at his jokes, initiating physical affection that I no longer felt. It was exhausting, but it was also strategic. A happy wife was a wife who wouldn't be looking for signs of betrayal. A satisfied spouse was someone who could be safely ignored while he focused on his secret life. The hardest part was managing my own responses. When he mentioned working late again, I had to suppress the urge to check his story. When he came home with that particular satisfied expression that I now recognized as post-affair contentment, I had to resist the impulse to confront him. Instead, I started documenting everything. I kept a small notebook hidden in my work bag, recording his lies, his moods, his schedule changes. I photographed receipts when he wasn't looking. I made mental notes of phone calls he took in other rooms, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a space. The performance extended to our social interactions too. At Connor's birthday party the following weekend, I was the perfect wife, attentive without being clingy, proud without being boastful, social without being attention-seeking. I made sure everyone saw how happy we seemed, how stable our marriage appeared. But I also watched Sheldon more carefully than I ever had before. I noticed how he checked his phone compulsively, how he stepped outside to take certain calls, how he seemed distracted even when he was trying to appear engaged. "You two seem to be doing well," Connor's wife mentioned during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "We are," I said, and for the first time in months I wasn't lying. We were doing well, just not in the way she thought. The most crucial part of the performance was making Sheldon feel secure in his deception. I needed him to believe that his strategy was working, that I was still the diminished, unsuspecting wife he'd been manipulating for months. So I continued to seek his approval for small decisions. I asked his opinion on dinner plans, clothing choices, weekend activities. I deferred to his judgment in conversations with others. I maintained the patterns of behavior that had made him confident in his ability to deceive me. But underneath the performance, I was changing in ways he couldn't see. Every lie he told made me stronger. Every manipulation he attempted made me more determined. Every moment of false intimacy made me more certain that I was doing the right thing. The woman who'd been shrinking for months was gone. In her place was someone much more dangerous, someone who understood exactly how to use his own confidence against him. Sheldon thought he was managing me, but I was managing him right back, and I was much better at it than he was. By the end of October, I had enough evidence to destroy him 3 times over. But I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed to understand the full scope of his deception, the complete timeline of his betrayal. More importantly, I needed to make sure that when I finally revealed what I knew, he would have no way to recover, no strategy to fall back on, no plan that could save him. He'd been playing chess while I'd been playing checkers. But now I was playing chess too, and I was already several moves ahead. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: our smart home system. 3 years ago, Sheldon had insisted on installing a comprehensive security setup: cameras, motion sensors, smart locks, the works. For safety, he'd said, especially with my job putting me in contact with people who might hold grudges. But what he'd forgotten was that I had administrative access to everything. Every camera, every sensor, every logged entry and exit. And more importantly, I knew how to use forensic software to recover deleted footage. I started with the basics. Our system kept rolling footage for 30 days before automatically deleting files, but I'd learned in my digital forensics training that deleted didn't mean gone. It just meant the space was available to be overwritten. Using recovery software I'd borrowed from the department's tech unit, I began pulling footage from dates that corresponded with his suspicious activities. The first recovered file was from 3 weeks earlier, 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, motion sensor triggered at our front door. I watched myself leave for my afternoon shift, then fast-forwarded to see what happened next. At 3:23 p.m., Sheldon's car pulled into our driveway. Nothing unusual there. He sometimes came home for lunch. But he wasn't alone. Bethany Lynch emerged from the passenger seat, looking around nervously before following him into our house. They stayed for 2 hours. I sat in my home office, staring at the timestamp, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just an affair conducted in hotel rooms and restaurants. He'd been bringing her into our home, into our bed, while I was at work protecting other people's families. The violation felt different from the hotel footage. This was personal in a way that made my hands shake as I saved the file to an encrypted drive. But there was more. Much more. The motion log showed a pattern of midday visits, stretching back 4 months. Always on days when I was working, always for roughly the same duration. Sometimes Bethany's car, sometimes his, sometimes both. They'd turned my house into their regular meeting place. I pulled up the interior camera footage next. Our bedroom camera, the one I'd insisted on after a break-in 2 blocks away, had captured everything. I watched 30 seconds before closing the file and encrypting it separately. I didn't need to see the details to know what was happening. The timestamps were enough. Its technology trail went deeper than just our home system. I'd noticed Sheldon's phone habits changing, but I hadn't realized how extensively he'd been covering his tracks. Using techniques I'd learned in cybercrime investigations, I began examining the digital footprint he thought he'd hidden. Our home Wi-Fi kept logs of every device connection and data transfer. Sheldon had been using his personal phone for normal activities, the ones I might accidentally see, but there was a second device connecting to our network. A phone I'd never seen, registered under a name I didn't recognize, Mitchell. The data logs for S. Mitchell were extensive. Dating apps, encrypted messaging platforms, email accounts, social media profiles, an entire digital identity separate from the man I'd married. He'd been living a double life so comprehensive that it included a fake name and fabricated personal history. I cross-referenced the S. Mitchell activity with the motion sensor logs. Every time Bethany visited our house, there was corresponding activity on his secret phone. Messages before she arrived, calls during her visits, more messages after she left. They were documenting their affair in real time, creating a digital record of their betrayal. But the most damaging discovery came from his cloud storage. Sheldon had been backing up his secret phone to an account he'd linked to our home network. Another security oversight that would have been impossible to detect without forensic training. The backup contained everything: photos, videos, message threads, financial records, travel plans. An entire relationship documented in meticulous detail. I found hundreds of messages between them, dating back 10 months. The early ones were flirtatious, professional boundaries, slowly dissolving. But as the relationship progressed, the messages became more explicit, more strategic, more cruel. "She has no idea," Bethany had written in August. "You could probably tell her directly, and she'd find a way to excuse it. She's so focused on playing hero cop, she doesn't even see what's happening in her own house," Sheldon had replied. "It's almost too easy. When are you going to tell her?" she'd asked in September. "Christmas," he'd answered. "I want to give her a gift she'll never forget." The messages revealed the full scope of their plan. They'd been discussing divorce strategy, asset division, even how to frame the situation to make me appear unstable or neglectful. Sheldon had been consulting with a divorce attorney since July, building a case against me while I'd been trying to save our marriage. But the most chilling discovery was a series of messages from just 2 weeks ago. "Got the papers filed today. Lawyer says timing is everything. Christmas morning, Trismas morning. She'll be so focused on the holiday, she won't think straight. Emotional women make bad decisions. And I'll be there to watch, front row seats. I want her to see that I've moved on, that I'm not the one who's going to be alone." I stared at the screen, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. This wasn't just about an affair, or even about leaving me. This was about humiliation, about psychological warfare, about breaking me down completely before walking away. They'd planned my destruction like a military operation, complete with timing, strategy, and objectives. They'd turned my marriage into a game where I was the only player who didn't know the rules. But they'd made one crucial error. They'd documented everything. Every cruel comment, every strategic decision, every moment of their conspiracy was preserved in digital amber, ready to be used against them. I created multiple copies of everything, storing them in different locations, different formats, different security levels. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was ammunition. By the time I finished that night, I had a complete picture of their relationship, their plans, and their massive underestimation of exactly who they were dealing with. Sheldon thought he was playing against a heartbroken wife, but he was actually playing against a detective who just spent 8 hours building the most comprehensive case file of her career, and now I knew exactly when and how he planned to strike, which meant I had 63 days to prepare my own Christmas surprise. The final piece of evidence arrived on December 12, disguised as a routine work assignment. Detective Luke Romoff from the Financial Crimes Unit had asked me to review surveillance footage from a downtown bank robbery case, standard procedure for cases involving multiple jurisdictions. But as I scrolled through the footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at 2:47 p.m. on December 10th, was my husband walking into First National Bank with Bethany Lynch. Not the branch where we kept our joint accounts, but a different location across town. They approached the customer service desk together, were directed to a private office, and emerged 30 minutes later carrying what appeared to be legal documents. I rewound the footage 3 times, studying their body language, their expressions, the way they walked out with the satisfied confidence of people who just accomplished something significant. This wasn't a social visit or a coincidence. This was business. I called in a favor with Maria Santos, a contact in the bank's security department who'd helped with previous cases. Within an hour, she'd confirmed my suspicions. Sheldon Lynch and Bethany Lynch had opened a joint account that day, with a substantial initial deposit that matched the amount of cash withdrawals from our joint account over the past 6 months. They also set up a safe deposit box, Maria added quietly. Joint access, paid for a full year in advance. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. This wasn't just about divorce papers or humiliation on Christmas morning. This was about financial theft, about systematically draining our joint assets while building a nest egg with his mistress. But more than that, it was about the timeline. December 10th was exactly 2 weeks before Christmas. Whatever they were planning, they were in the final preparation phase. I drove home that evening with a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before. I'd been gathering evidence for months, but now I realized I was running out of time. Whatever Sheldon's Christmas surprise was, it was going to be bigger than divorce papers. It was going to be a complete financial and emotional devastation designed to leave me with nothing. That night, while Sheldon was at another client dinner, I conducted a thorough search of our house. I'd been careful before, always making sure everything was exactly where I'd found it. But this time, I was looking for specific evidence, documents, financial records, anything that might reveal the full scope of their plan. I found it in the most obvious place, his home office, in a folder marked insurance papers that he'd buried beneath years of old policies and warranties. Inside was a complete exit strategy. Divorce papers, already signed and notarized, dated for December 25th. A list of our assets with notations about what he considered his versus marital property. A timeline for moving out, complete with a new address I recognized as Bethany's apartment complex. But the most damaging document was a letter from his divorce attorney, outlining a strategy to paint me as an unstable, work-obsessed spouse who'd been neglecting the marriage. The letter included specific incidents I remembered, nights I'd worked late, cases that had stressed me out, arguments we'd had about my job demanding schedule. They'd been building a narrative where I was the problem, where my career had destroyed our marriage, where Sheldon was the victim of a wife who'd chosen her job over her family. It was a carefully crafted story designed to maximize his financial gain while minimizing his responsibility. The letter also mentioned emotional documentation and witness statements that would support his claims. I realized with growing horror that our recent interactions, the dinners with friends, the family gatherings, the moments when I'd seemed distant or preoccupied, had all been evidence-gathering opportunities for him. Every time I'd checked my phone during dinner, every time I'd seemed tired after a long shift, every time I'd been quiet during social events, he'd been cataloging it as proof of my inadequacy as a wife. But the most chilling part was the final paragraph of the attorney's letter. The Christmas timing is strategic. Holiday emotions will work in your favor, especially if the revelation is public enough to generate sympathy. The presence of Mrs. Lynch as a witness to your wife's reaction will be crucial for later testimony about her instability. I read that paragraph 3 times, each time feeling more sick. They weren't just planning to humiliate me on Christmas morning, they were planning to use my reaction as evidence against me in divorce proceedings. My pain, my shock, my emotional response to being betrayed would become ammunition in their legal strategy. I photographed every document, every page, every piece of evidence in that folder. Then I carefully returned everything to its exact position, making sure no one would know I'd been there. As I sat in my car in our driveway, staring at the photos on my phone, I realized I was looking at something more than just divorce papers and financial manipulation. I was looking at a conspiracy designed to destroy not just my marriage, but my reputation, my financial security, and my emotional well-being. They'd spent months planning my downfall, crafting a narrative where I was the villain, and they were the victims. They'd documented every moment of weakness, every sign of stress, every indication that I was anything less than a perfect wife. But they'd made one fatal error in their planning. They'd assumed I would react emotionally, that I would fall apart when confronted with their betrayal, that I would give them the dramatic breakdown they needed for their legal strategy. They'd planned for the woman I'd been 6 months ago, the one who'd been shrinking, apologizing, accepting blame for problems I hadn't created. They hadn't planned for the woman I'd become, the detective who'd spent months building a case against them, the investigator who'd documented every lie, every deception, every moment of their conspiracy. They wanted a public breakdown on Christmas morning. They wanted to use my reaction as evidence against me. I smiled as I started the car. They were going to get a reaction, all right, just not the one they were expecting. I had 13 days to prepare my own Christmas surprise, and unlike their plan, mine was going to be perfectly legal, completely documented, and absolutely devastating. They'd been playing chess while thinking I was playing checkers, but it turned out I'd been playing chess all along, and I was about to put them in checkmate. The morning of December 23rd, I woke up with the calm clarity that comes from knowing exactly what's about to happen. 2 days until Christmas, 2 days until Sheldon's carefully orchestrated plan to destroy me would unfold exactly as he'd imagined it. Except it wouldn't unfold as he'd imagined it at all. I'd spent the previous 10 days making my own preparations, moving through our house like a ghost, setting up systems he'd never notice, while maintaining the performance of a wife who had no idea what was coming. The cameras were the most important element. I'd upgraded our home security system under the guise of holiday protection, adding discrete recording devices to every room where the confrontation might take place. The living room, the kitchen, the dining room, all equipped with professional-grade audio and video recording that would capture every word, every expression, every moment of what was about to happen. Good thinking, Sheldon had said when I'd mentioned the security upgrade. You can never be too careful during the holidays. Lots of break-ins this time of year. He'd actually helped me position some of the cameras, unknowingly setting up perfect angles for his own downfall. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd also made copies of everything, every document, every photo, every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past 3 months. Multiple copies, stored in different locations, with different people. Ella had one set, Connor had another, and I'd stored a third set in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. But the most crucial preparation was emotional. I'd spent weeks practicing my reaction, rehearsing the moment when he would hand me those divorce papers and expect me to fall apart. I'd studied myself in mirrors, modulated my voice, planned every word I would say and every expression I would wear. The woman who'd been shrinking for months would have given him exactly what he wanted: tears, pleading, desperation. But that woman was gone. In her place was someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't emotional satisfaction, it was cold, calculated justice. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I went through the motions of our holiday traditions. I made his favorite breakfast, wrapped presents I knew he'd never get to open, set the table with the good china we'd received as wedding gifts 12 years ago. Everything had to appear normal, festive, unsuspecting. Sheldon was unusually cheerful, almost giddy with anticipation. He kept checking his phone, smiling at messages I couldn't see, humming Christmas carols under his breath. To anyone watching, he looked like a man excited about giving his wife a wonderful surprise. In a way, he was. "I can't wait for tomorrow morning," he said, over dinner, raising his wine glass in a toast. "I have something very special planned." "I'm sure you do," I replied, clinking my glass against his. "I have something special for you too." The look of satisfaction on his face was almost pitying. He thought he knew what my something special was, probably lingerie, or cologne, or some other gift a devoted wife would give her husband. Something that would make his betrayal seem even more cruel, even more justified. That night, he went to bed early, claiming he wanted to be fresh for tomorrow. I stayed up, making final preparations, checking camera angles, ensuring everything was ready. At 2 a.m., I heard his phone buzz with a text message. He stirred, checked it, and smiled in the darkness. I already knew what the message said. I'd been monitoring his communications for weeks, watching the final coordination between him and Bethany. She would arrive at 7 a.m., let herself in with the spare key he'd given her, and hide in the kitchen until the moment was right. They'd rehearsed this like a theatrical performance, complete with blocking and timing. At 6:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, I heard her car in the driveway. The motion sensors I'd strategically positioned tracked her movement from her car to our front door, capturing her face clearly as she used the key. She looked nervous but excited, like someone about to witness a long-anticipated spectacle. I listened to her soft footsteps in the hallway, the quiet opening and closing of the kitchen door, the muffled sounds of her settling into position. She was probably making coffee, trying to look casual and domestic when the moment came for her grand entrance. Sheldon woke at 7:15, right on schedule. I watched him through barely opened eyes as he checked his phone, smiled at whatever message was waiting, and quietly got dressed. He moved with the careful precision of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. By 7:30, we were both in the living room, surrounded by wrapped presents and the warm glow of Christmas tree lights. The scene was perfect, cozy, intimate, exactly what you'd expect from a loving couple on Christmas morning. Sheldon was practically vibrating with anticipation. He kept glancing toward the kitchen, where I knew Bethany was waiting for her cue. Every movement, every breath, every second was building toward the moment he'd been planning for months. "Should we start with presents?" he asked, his voice thick with barely contained excitement. "Of course," I said, settling onto the couch with my coffee. "I can't wait to see what you've gotten me." The cameras were rolling. The evidence was secured. The stage was set. In the kitchen, Bethany Lynch was probably holding her breath, waiting for her moment to emerge and witness my destruction. But she was about to witness something entirely different. They both were, because while they'd been planning my downfall, I'd been planning their complete and utter destruction, and unlike their plan, mine was going to work exactly as intended. The envelope was exactly as I'd expected it, plain white, my name written in Sheldon's careful handwriting, positioned under the tree like a normal Christmas gift. But there was nothing normal about the way his hands trembled slightly as he handed it to me, or the way his eyes kept darting toward the kitchen where Bethany was waiting. "What's this?" I asked, turning the envelope over in my hands. I kept my voice light, curious, exactly what an unsuspecting wife would sound like. "Just open it," he said, settling back into his chair. That familiar anticipation was clear in his voice, now mixed with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. I opened the envelope slowly, aware that every movement was being recorded by multiple cameras. Inside were the divorce papers, exactly as I'd known they would be. Petition for dissolution of marriage, already filed, already signed by him, waiting only for my signature to make it official. I read the first few lines, letting my face register the appropriate shock, the dawning understanding, the hurt that any wife would feel in this moment. But underneath the performance, I was cataloging details, noting the filing date, the attorney's name, the specific language used to describe our irreconcilable differences. "Sheldon," I said quietly, looking up at him. "What is this?" "I think it's pretty clear," he replied, and there was that cruel edge to his voice I'd been hearing for months. "I want a divorce, Aubrey. I'm done with this marriage." That's when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps from the kitchen. Right on cue, Bethany Lynch appeared in the doorway, wearing my robe, holding a cup of coffee like she belonged there. She'd styled her hair, applied makeup, dressed for the performance of her life. "Merry Christmas," she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of false sympathy that only comes from someone who enjoys watching others suffer. I stared at her, then at Sheldon, letting the pieces click into place with the appropriate dramatic timing. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long, what?" Sheldon's smile was widening, clearly enjoying the moment he'd been planning for months. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been planning this?" Bethany moved closer, settling onto the arm of Sheldon's chair with the casual intimacy of someone who'd been doing it for months. "Long enough," she said. "We wanted to wait until after the holidays to make it official, but Sheldon thought Christmas morning would be more memorable." I looked down at the papers again, my hands shaking slightly, not from emotion, but from the effort of controlling my reaction. "You've been planning this," I said. It wasn't a question. "For months," Bethany confirmed, clearly proud of their elaborate scheme. The timing, the approach, even making sure I was here for the big reveal. Sheldon wanted to make sure you understood that he'd moved on, that he wasn't going to be the one left alone. She was right about that. I would never forget this moment, but not for the reasons she thought. I need to think, I said, standing up and walking to the window. This is a lot to process. Behind me I could hear them whispering, probably congratulating themselves on how perfectly their plan was unfolding. I used the moment to compose myself, to prepare for what came next. When I turned back around, they were both watching me with the expectation of tears, of begging, of the emotional breakdown they'd so carefully orchestrated. Instead, I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a pen, the same pen I'd used to sign Christmas cards, grocery lists, all the mundane documents of our life together. "What are you doing?" Sheldon asked, wariness creeping into his voice. "Signing them," I said simply, returning to the couch. "If you want a divorce, you can have one." I signed the papers quickly, efficiently, with the same calm precision I used to sign arrest warrants. No drama, no tears, no desperate pleas for reconciliation. Just a signature and a date. "That's it?" Sheldon asked, confusion replacing his earlier satisfaction. "That's it," I confirmed, handing the papers back to him. "Congratulations on your new relationship." They exchanged a glance, clearly thrown off by my reaction. This wasn't the script they'd written. The devastated wife was supposed to fall apart, to give them the dramatic scene they could use as evidence of my instability. But I wasn't done yet. "Actually," I said, walking back to the tree, "I have something for you too." I reached behind the tree and pulled out a beautifully wrapped gift box, red paper, gold ribbon, the works. I'd prepared it weeks ago, though I'd hoped I'd never need to use it. "What's this?" Sheldon asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "Your real Christmas present," I said, handing it to him. "I think you're going to find it very interesting." He took the box, and for the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Bethany leaned closer, equally curious about what could be inside. "Open it," I said, settling back into my chair with my coffee. As he untied the ribbon with shaking hands, I felt a calm satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was the one in control, and they were about to find out exactly what that meant. Sheldon's hands froze on the ribbon as he stared at the box. Something in my tone, in my posture, in the way I was watching him had shifted the dynamic in the room. The confident man who'd been orchestrating my humiliation suddenly looked uncertain, almost afraid. "Go ahead," I said gently, my voice carrying none of the devastation they'd been expecting. "Open it." He pulled away the wrapping paper slowly, revealing a plain cardboard box underneath. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single flash drive and a manila envelope thick with documents. "What is this?" Bethany asked, leaning forward to get a better look. "Evidence," I said simply. 3 months' worth of surveillance, financial records, communication logs, and digital forensics. Everything you've been doing, everything you've been planning, every lie you've told. Sheldon's face went pale. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been investigating you," I corrected. "There's a difference. Spying implies I was doing something improper. Investigating is what I do for a living." I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd positioned my laptop the night before. A few clicks brought up the first piece of evidence, hotel surveillance footage from 8 months ago, showing Sheldon and Bethany entering the Marriott together. "This is from March 15th, I said, turning the screen so they could see it. "The first documented instance of your affair, though I suspect it started earlier." Bethany's coffee cup clattered against the saucer as she set it down. "You can't, that's private property. That footage isn't legal." "Actually, it is," I replied calmly. "It was obtained through proper channels as part of an ongoing fraud investigation. The fact that it captured your extracurricular activities was just a bonus." I clicked to the next file. "This is from our home security system, September 23rd, 2:47 p.m. Motion sensors triggered when you entered our house while I was at work." The footage showed Bethany following Sheldon through our front door, both of them laughing about something. The timestamp proved she'd been in our house, in our bed, while I was working my shift. The system keeps logs of all entrances and exits, I continued. I have records of 17 separate visits over the past 4 months. Always when I was working, always for approximately 2 hours. Sheldon found his voice. This is illegal surveillance. You can't use this against me. It's my house too, I said. I have every right to monitor my own property, and since you helped me position some of these cameras, you consented to the recording. I pulled up another file, screenshots of text messages between them, recovered from his cloud backup. This is from October 12th. You're discussing divorce strategy and how to make me appear unstable. I read aloud. She's so focused on playing hero cop, she doesn't even see what's happening in her own house. It's almost too easy. Bethany's face flushed red. You hacked his phone. That's a federal crime. I didn't hack anything, I said. Your boyfriend was backing up his secret phone to our shared home network. Basic digital forensics recovered what he thought he'd deleted. I clicked through more files methodically, each one revealing another layer of their deception. The fake work events, the financial manipulation, the systematic transfer of assets to accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. This is from December 10th, I said, showing them bank surveillance footage. You opening a joint account and safe deposit box. Interesting timing, just 2 weeks before Christmas. Sheldon's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. How did you? That's confidential bank information. Is it? I asked innocently. Or is it evidence of financial fraud and asset concealment? Because that's what it looks like to me. I turned to face them directly. You want to know what else I found? Communications with your divorce attorney dating back to July, strategic planning documents outlining how to paint me as an unstable, negligent wife, financial records showing systematic withdrawal of marital assets. I clicked to another file, and this is my personal favorite, your plan to use my emotional reaction this morning as evidence of my instability. You documented everything, photographed every moment when I seemed tired or distracted, building a case against me while I was trying to save our marriage. The room was dead silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Sheldon and Bethany sat frozen, their elaborate Christmas morning surprise crumbling around them. You thought you were so clever, I continued, my voice still calm and professional, planning my destruction like a military operation. But you made one fatal error. What's that? Sheldon whispered. You assumed I was the same woman I was 6 months ago, the one who apologized for taking up space in her own life, the one who accepted blame for problems she didn't create. I smiled, cold and sharp, but that woman is gone. I closed the laptop and picked up the manila envelope from the gift box. This contains copies of everything I just showed you, plus about 30 pages of additional evidence. Financial records, communication logs, witness statements, forensic analysis. What do you want? Bethany asked, her voice shaking. I want you to understand that your little Christmas surprise just backfired spectacularly, I said. You wanted to destroy me this morning. Instead, you've just handed me everything I need to destroy both of you. Sheldon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face went even paler. What did you do? I sent copies of everything to your HR department, your divorce attorney, and several of my colleagues in financial crimes. I checked my watch. They should be receiving it right about now. The sound of another phone buzzing filled the room. Bethany grabbed her device, read the message, and went white. You can't do this, she said. I already did, I replied. The question now is what happens next. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Sheldon stared at his phone, reading what I assumed was a message from his boss or HR department. Bethany was scrolling through her own device, her face growing paler with each notification. But I wasn't done, not even close. There's something else, I said, reaching into the gift box one more time. Something I saved for last. I pulled out a small square envelope, thinner than the others, but somehow more ominous. Both of them watched as I opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the tension build. Inside was a single photograph, a sonogram image, grainy and black and white, but unmistakably clear in its meaning. I'm pregnant, I said, my voice steady and matter-of-fact. 8 weeks today. Sheldon's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hope, calculation, and then dawning horror as he realized what this meant for his carefully laid plans. He started, then stopped. That's wonderful news. Is it? I asked, tilting my head. Because according to your communications with Miss Lynch, you've been telling her for months that we haven't been intimate, that our marriage was essentially over, that you were just waiting for the right moment to leave. I set the sonogram on the coffee table between us. This creates something of a problem for your narrative, doesn't it? Bethany leaned forward, studying the image. How do we know it's even his? I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd given all morning. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I have the answer right here. I pulled out my phone and opened a calendar app, scrolling back to highlight specific dates. These are the dates we were intimate over the past 3 months. Notice how they correspond exactly with the dates you weren't visiting our house. I turned the phone toward them. Conception would have been approximately October 15th. That's this date here, the night you had your big fight about him spending too much time at work and stormed out of his apartment. Sheldon's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I could see him doing the math, remembering that night, remembering coming home to me seeking comfort after his fight with her. The timing is actually perfect, I continued, because it means this baby was conceived during one of the few times in recent months when you were actually being a husband instead of a cheating bastard. I walked to the mantel and picked up a legal document I'd placed there earlier. This is a paternity acknowledgement form. In case there's any question about the father's identity, we can resolve it immediately. You can't force me to take a paternity test, Sheldon said, finally finding his voice. You're absolutely right, I agreed. But I can request one as part of the divorce proceedings. And since you've filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, rather than adultery, or any other fault-based grounds, the court will be very interested in ensuring proper child support calculations. I set the document on the coffee table next to the sonogram. Of course, if you'd prefer to avoid the publicity of a contested paternity case, we could always reach a different arrangement. Bethany stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. This is between you and your husband. Actually, I said, not moving from my position, you're wrong about that too. Because while you've been busy playing house with my husband, I've been building a case against both of you. I pulled out another document from the envelope. This is a civil complaint for alienation of affection. Did you know that's still a valid tort in this state? It means I can sue you personally for deliberately interfering with my marriage. Her face went white. That's not real. It absolutely is. And with the evidence I've gathered, the communications between you two, the financial records, the documented timeline of your affair, I have an excellent chance of winning a substantial judgment. I flipped through the pages. The damages could include emotional distress, financial losses, and punitive damages for particularly egregious conduct, like, say, planning to humiliate me on Christmas morning for your own entertainment. Sheldon tried to stand, but his legs seemed unsteady. You can't destroy our lives over this. I'm not destroying anything, I said calmly. I'm simply ensuring that actions have consequences. You both made choices, calculated, deliberate choices, to betray me, to steal from me, to plan my humiliation. Now you get to live with the results of those choices. I walked back to my laptop and pulled up one final file. This is the complete timeline of your affair, cross-referenced with financial records, communication logs, and witness statements. 3 months of investigation, condensed into a comprehensive case file. The document was over 50 pages long, organized like a police report, complete with evidence summaries and witness interviews. I've sent copies to the appropriate authorities, I continued. Your employer will be conducting their own investigation into the misuse of company resources. The IRS will be reviewing your tax filings for unreported income, and the family court will be examining the evidence of asset concealment and financial fraud. I closed the laptop and looked at them both. You wanted to give me a Christmas morning I'd never forget. Well, congratulations. You succeeded. Sheldon's phone buzzed again, then again, then again. The sound of his carefully constructed life beginning to collapse in real time. Pulsed in pusa bet. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "I want you to understand that the woman you thought you could manipulate and discard is gone. In her place is someone who's very, very good at her job." I picked up the sonogram and held it gently. "And my job, starting right now, is protecting this child from ever having to witness what you just tried to do to me." The room fell silent, except for the continued buzzing of their phones and the distant sound of Christmas morning traffic outside. But inside our house, the holiday had taken on a very different meaning. They'd planned my destruction. Instead, they'd orchestrated their own. The aftermath wasn't dramatic, like in the movies. There was no screaming, no thrown objects, no storming out with slamming doors. Instead, there was just the slow, suffocating realization that everything they'd built their future on had just crumbled to dust. Sheldon sat in his chair, staring at the divorce papers he'd handed me with such confidence 30 minutes earlier. They seemed different now, not like the weapon he'd intended them to be, but like evidence of his own miscalculation. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but there was no conviction in his voice. "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning. You filed for divorce, remember? That means we'll be going to court, where all of this evidence will become public record." Bethany was pacing now, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried to reach someone, probably her own attorney, maybe her boss, possibly her family. Each call seemed to go to voicemail, each message more desperate than the last. "My career is ruined," she said, hanging up after leaving another frantic message. "My reputation, my job, everything. Actions have consequences," I replied simply. "You chose to have an affair with a married man. You chose to help him steal from his wife. You chose to participate in a plan to humiliate me. These are the natural results of those choices." Sheldon's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID, and his face went ashen. "It's my mother," he said. "Answer it," I suggested. "She's probably calling to wish you a Merry Christmas." He let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. The sound of his extended family trying to reach him on Christmas morning, probably confused by whatever messages or news they'd received. "They don't understand," he said, more to himself than to me. "They don't know the whole story." "What story is that?" I asked. "The one where you're the victim, where your wife was so focused on her career that you had no choice but to cheat, where you were forced to steal joint assets because I wasn't paying enough attention to you." He didn't answer, but I could see him trying to construct a narrative that would make sense to his family, his friends, his colleagues. The problem was, I had evidence that contradicted every possible version of events he could create. Bethany finally stopped pacing and turned to face me. "What do you want? Money? An apology? For us to disappear?" "I want you to understand something," I said, standing up and walking to the window. "For months, I've been living in a house where I felt like a stranger, walking on eggshells, apologizing for taking up space, doubting my own perceptions. You both made me feel like I was the problem." I turned back to face them, but I wasn't the problem. I was the target. "And now you're about to learn the difference between targeting a victim and targeting a detective." Connor's voice echoed in my memory. "You're second-guessing yourself. That's not like you." He'd been right. The old Aubrey, the confident, decisive police officer, had been buried under months of systematic manipulation. But she was back now, and she was very, very angry. "The restraining order will be filed Monday morning," I continued. "Both of you are prohibited from contacting me, except through attorneys. Sheldon, you have until this evening to collect your personal belongings. Bethany, you're trespassing in my house right now." "Our house," Sheldon corrected weakly. "My house," I said firmly. "Check the deed. It's in my name only, purchased with my savings, before we were married. You might want to review the prenup you signed, the one you were too arrogant to read carefully." The color drained from his face. "What prenup?" I smiled. "The one you agreed to 3 years ago, when you were drunk and thought you were calling my bluff. The one that protects all premarital assets in case of divorce due to adultery." Bethany grabbed her purse. "I'm leaving." "Good choice," I said. "Drive safely. The roads are icy, and you're about to have a very difficult few months ahead of you." As she headed for the door, I called after her. "Oh, and Bethany, you might want to find a new job. I doubt Morrison Marketing will keep you on after they finish their investigation." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Sheldon remained in his chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his Christmas morning surprise. "Pack your things," I said gently. "It's time for you to go." The weeks that followed were quieter than I'd expected. I'd braced myself for retaliation, for desperate attempts to salvage their situation, for the kind of dramatic confrontations that happen in movies. Instead, there was just silence. Sheldon moved out that evening, taking only his clothes and personal items. He left behind the watch I'd given him that morning, still in its box on the kitchen counter. I donated it to charity the next day, along with most of his remaining possessions. The legal proceedings moved forward with mechanical efficiency. His attorney tried to challenge the prenup, but the evidence was overwhelming. Video of him signing it, witnesses to his voluntary agreement, forensic analysis of the document's authenticity. By January 15th, the divorce was finalized on terms that left him with exactly what he'd contributed to the marriage. Nothing. Bethany disappeared entirely. Rumors said she'd moved back to her hometown, but I didn't investigate. She was no longer my problem. Connor returned to work after the holidays with a knowing smile. "Heard you had an interesting Christmas," he said, settling into his desk chair. "Peaceful," I replied. "Very peaceful." "Good, you look different." He was right, I felt different. The woman who'd been apologizing for existing had been replaced by someone who took up space confidently, who spoke without second-guessing herself, who trusted her own instincts again. My pregnancy progressed smoothly. The baby was healthy, active, and seemed to thrive on the reduced stress in my life. I painted the nursery a soft green, hung pictures of strong women on the walls, and filled the room with books about courage and independence. Ella moved in during my second trimester, claiming she needed a change of scenery but really just wanting to help with the transition. We fell into an easy rhythm. She worked on her art, while I prepared for motherhood, both of us building new lives in the space where my old life had died. The house felt different too, lighter, somehow. I rearranged the furniture, threw out items that reminded me of him, and slowly filled the spaces with things that brought me joy. Plants, books, photographs of real friends and family members who'd supported me through the chaos. By spring, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to walk on eggshells in my own home. The constant hypervigilance, the careful monitoring of someone else's moods, the exhausting performance of being smaller than I was, all of it seemed like a distant memory. I was 5 months pregnant when I ran into Sheldon at the grocery store. He looked tired, older, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance. When he saw me, his face lit up with something that might have been hope. "Aubrey," he said, approaching cautiously. "You look good." "I feel good," I replied honestly. "How's the baby?" "Healthy, strong, due in July." He nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "I've been thinking about what happened, about us. Maybe we could know," I said simply. "We couldn't, but the baby needs a father." I smiled, resting my hand on my growing belly. "The baby will have everything they need, starting with a mother who knows her own worth." I walked away without looking back. Some chapters of your life deserve to be closed firmly, with no possibility of reopening. Christmas morning, 1 year later, looked nothing like the year before. The tree was smaller but warmer, decorated with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights that cast a golden glow across the living room. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee, and for the first time in years, I woke up without checking anyone else's mood first. My daughter, Grace, was 6 months old and sitting in her high chair, babbling happily while trying to grab the ribbon on a wrapped present. She had my eyes but her father's stubborn chin, and watching her discover the world with fearless curiosity reminded me daily of who I used to be before I let someone else's insecurities diminish me. Ella was in the kitchen, making her famous holiday breakfast while Connor and his wife set the table. My parents had driven down from their retirement home, my mother cooing over Grace, while my father helped Connor assemble a toy that came with 47 pieces and instructions in 3 languages. She's going to be trouble, my mother said, watching Grace methodically tear apart a piece of wrapping paper. Look at that focus. Good, I replied, settling into my chair with Grace on my lap. The world needs more women who cause the right kind of trouble. I looked around the table at the faces of people who'd supported me through the darkness, who'd celebrated my strength instead of trying to diminish it. This was what Christmas morning was supposed to feel like: safe, warm, full of people who loved you exactly as you were. Connor raised his coffee mug in a toast. To new beginnings, to knowing your worth, Ella added. To never settling for less than you deserve, my mother chimed in. I lifted my own mug, looking down at Grace, who was reaching for the Christmas tree lights with determined little fingers, to showing her a different way. As we clinked our mugs together, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back was someone I recognized, confident, content, unafraid to take up space in her own life. Sheldon had been right about one thing: I would never forget that Christmas morning. But not because he'd broken me, because it was the day I remembered who I really was. The day I discovered that sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the courage to fight back. And the best revenge isn't destruction, it's building something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to destroy you. Grace gurgled and reached for my face, her tiny fingers warm against my cheek. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "You're going to be so much stronger than I ever was." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and clean, covering the world in possibility.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.